Imagine being treated like a ghost in your own home for 27 years while your brother is raised like a golden prince. That was my reality until one single shocking phone call changed everything and destroyed my family's lives forever. Welcome to Untold Revealed. I'm so glad you're here. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell if you're new to the channel. My name is Elena, and I am exactly 34 years old. For almost 3 decades, my parents treated my brother like royalty while I was hidden away in the shadows. I washed his clothes, scrubbed his floors, and lived entirely in his shadow. My parents looked me in the eye and told me that some children are simply born to serve, while others are born to lead. But everything shifted on the day of my brother's lavish Hamptons wedding. My brother's new father-in-law took a close look at my face and noticed a rare detail hidden in my eyes. That observation led to a DNA test that didn't just expose a 30-year-old secret, it completely destroyed an empire built on lies. Before we continue, smash that like button and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. The Hamptons estate was a massive display of wealth, where ocean waves provided a rhythmic backdrop in the distance. A string quartet played soft melodies near a massive infinity pool, while crystal chandeliers hung from the ceilings of giant white tents. The air smelled like expensive jasmine and salty sea breeze. But here is the crazy part. I wasn't a guest at this wedding. I was forced to wear a scratchy black and white maid uniform made of cheap synthetic fabric that stuck to my skin in the sweltering heat. I walked through the sea of elite guests with my head bowed, desperately trying to stay invisible, just like my family demanded. If you're enjoying this so far, make sure you're subscribed and hit that bell so you don't miss the next part of this reveal. My older brother Grant was the groom, and this was his ultimate big moment. He stood by the mahogany bar, looking like a billionaire tech CEO in a custom tuxedo that cost more than I'd been allowed to spend on food in a decade. He laughed loudly with venture capitalists and tech industry titans, pretending to be someone he wasn't. Beside him was his bride, Maya. She was a brilliant, independent black woman who looked stunning in a custom designer gown that swept across the lawn. Maya had a sharp mind and a strong moral compass, and she had absolutely no idea about the dark rot hiding beneath her new husband's charming exterior. I was struggling to hold a heavy silver tray loaded with crystal flutes of vintage champagne. My arms ached, and my feet were blistered inside cheap black shoes, but I knew better than to stop. My mother, Margaret, demanded absolute perfection and treated me like the lowest-ranking member of the staff. She wore an emerald green gown and heavy diamonds, playing the society matriarch with terrifying precision. She moved through the crowd with tight-lipped smiles, collecting compliments from anyone she thought was important. Now this is where it gets really interesting. As I walked past the main head table, Margaret looked me in the eye with a malicious gleam and deliberately stepped into my path. I tried to pivot to avoid her, but she hooked her designer heel right around my ankle. Everything felt like it was moving in slow motion. I lost my balance and pitched forward as the heavy silver tray slipped from my grasp. Dozens of crystal glasses shattered against the marble floor with a violent, deafening crash that silenced the entire party. Which part of this family dynamic surprised you the most? Drop a comment below and let me know. A massive wave of sticky, expensive champagne rushed across the stone floor, stopping just inches from the delicate white hem of Maya's custom wedding dress. The string quartet stopped playing instantly, and the entire reception went dead silent. Hundreds of wealthy, powerful people turned their heads to stare at me as I lay there, sprawled out on the wet, dangerous floor. My uniform was soaked through with the cold liquid, and my knees were badly scraped by the jagged pieces of broken glass. Margaret looked down at me from her towering height, her face twisted with total, pure disgust. She didn't offer to help me up. She didn't even bother to ask if I was hurt. "Look at what you have done," Margaret sneered, her voice cutting through the silent courtyard so every single guest could hear her clearly. "Some children are just born to serve, and you clearly can't even manage that correctly. Pick up the broken glass, you worthless dropout. If you think Margaret is being totally heartless right now, smash that like button so we can show her some real energy." I looked up at my older brother, Grant, hoping against everything I knew for even a tiny bit of human kindness. But Grant just took a slow, calm sip of his champagne and smirked at me. He turned back to his group of rich investor friends, shaking his head and laughing softly to himself. He didn't say a single word to defend his own sister. Instead, he seemed to enjoy every second of my public humiliation, perfectly happy to let me take the full blame for our mother's planned cruelty. But here is the crazy part that none of these people realized while they were laughing at me. The air felt heavy and suffocating. The guests whispered behind their manicured hands, judging the clumsy, pathetic servant who had almost ruined the perfect high society wedding. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, fighting back the burning tears of anger and shame. I knew that if I had any reaction at all, it would only give them more fuel for their twisted story. I was trapped in a nightmare they had built specifically to break my spirit and keep me in my place. But as I carefully picked up the sharp pieces of crystal with my bare, bleeding hands, a cold wave of absolute clarity washed over me. I wasn't the helpless victim they thought I was. While I was down there on the floor, I was quietly watching, constantly calculating, and silently surviving. Every mean word Margaret spat and every arrogant look Grant gave me was just more fuel for the silent fire burning in my chest. They thought they had finally crushed me into total submission, but they were blind to the fact that when you corner a mind like mine, it sharpens itself into a lethal weapon. By the way, if you want to see how this revenge plan plays out, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next part of the story. The whispers of the high society crowd continued to wash over me, making it clear that in their eyes, I was the ultimate family failure. But inside my own head, I was already visualizing the complex digital architecture of Grant's entire fraudulent company. I already knew every password, every hidden backdoor, and every dirty financial secret they were trying so hard to bury. They demanded that I serve them, but they were completely unaware that I was just waiting for the right moment to tear their entire world apart. As a drop of my own blood mixed with the spilled champagne on the marble floor, I made a silent promise. This would finally be the very last day I ever bowed my head to them. Then my father, Andrew, marched over to join the spectacle. His expensive leather shoes crunched loudly over the broken glass. He grabbed my upper arm, digging his fingers deep into my skin, and pulled me up with so much force it almost popped my shoulder out of place. "Don't mind her, everyone," Andrew announced to the silent crowd, forcing a fake, apologetic smile toward his friends and Grant's board members. "My daughter has always been a little unstable." I can't believe he actually said that in front of everyone. Which family member do you think is the worst so far? Drop a comment and let me know. Wait until you hear the lie he told next. It was so cruel it actually made my skin crawl. He told everyone I was terribly jealous of Grant's success and that I was always trying to ruin his big moments. He called it a tragedy and told the guests they do the best they can with my condition. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I could actually taste blood. I knelt down on the cold, damp floor and started picking up the sharp pieces of broken glass with my bare hands, not even caring about the cuts forming on my palms. I just let them call me a jealous dropout. I let those wealthy guests look down at me with pity while they whispered to each other, believing every word of that perfectly crafted lie. If you think those parents are absolute monsters, smash that like button right now. Andrew and Margaret had spent decades making up this narrative. To the rest of the world, they were saintly parents dealing with a deeply disturbed child. But to them, I was just a dark stain on their perfect image, a problem they had to hide away whenever company came over. They used my forced silence as proof that I was sick, using my obedience to justify their extreme control. If I cried, they called me hysterical. If I argued, they said I was having an episode. So, I learned very early on to keep my face like stone. I looked over at the head table and saw Grant already turning his back to the scene. He put his arm around his new wife, Maya, and whispered something in her ear while shaking his head. He had that practiced look of a brother who was just exhausted by his sister's behavior. Now, here is where it gets really interesting. Grant was the golden child. He was the center of the universe my parents built. While he was sent to elite boarding schools and given the keys to luxury cars, I was pulled out of high school. They told everyone I had behavior issues, but really, they just wanted to banish me to the windowless basement of our home. I became an unpaid servant for my own family. I spent my entire youth scrubbing Grant's bedroom, cooking his meals, and washing his designer clothes while I watched my own life pass me by from the shadows. He had private tutors for math, while I had a mop and a bucket of bleach. He never once asked why his sister wore old thin clothes while he had custom suits. He just accepted that I was there to serve him as if it was his natural birthright. If you're enjoying this story so far, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next part. But the way Grant treated me wasn't even the most shocking part. Maya looked at me over Grant's shoulder, and her dark eyes showed she was confused and a little worried. She actually took a step toward me, like she wanted to ask if I needed bandages for my bleeding hands. But Andrew stopped her immediately. He put a heavy, fatherly hand on her shoulder and shook his head sadly, whispering more lies about my unpredictable nature. Maya stopped, stuck between her basic human decency and the warnings of her new father-in-law. Grant just ignored it all and snapped his fingers for more champagne. That hurt more than anything. He didn't hate me, he just felt nothing. To him, I was just like a broken appliance, a tool that didn't work right and occasionally made a mess. I swept the glass into a pan, feeling the sharp edges cut deeper into my skin. I told myself to let them believe the lie. I stayed silent because even one tear would be used against me. Which part of this family's behavior makes you the angriest? Drop it in the comments before we get to what happened next. If I let even a single tear fall, Andrew would point it out to the crowd and tell everyone I was completely crazy. Margaret would use my fair anger as a perfect excuse to lock me back in that dark basement for weeks on end. So I gave them absolutely nothing. I became a hollow shell, a blank wall for their mean lies. But behind my blank, dead eyes, my mind was actually racing with scary and sharp detail. I thought about the lonely hours I spent in that dark basement, lit only by the blue light of my computer screens. I thought about the complex security systems I built while they slept in their luxury beds upstairs. They truly believed they had cut me off from the world, but they had actually given me quiet and private time to conquer the digital one. Every mean thing Margaret said and every chore Andrew forced on me simply added more fuel to an engine they could not see. They wanted me to be their servant, not knowing I was just waiting for the right time to tear down their whole fake world. If you're enjoying this so far, smash that like button. But here's the crazy part. I stood up slowly, the heavy dustpan shaking a little bit in my bleeding hands. The musicians started playing a fast classical song again, trying their best to wash away the heavy awkwardness of the moment. The guests quickly turned back to their expensive conversations, eager to act like the ugly scene had never happened. Margaret shot me one last hateful look, a silent order to disappear into the kitchen and never show my face again. Andrew fixed his silk tie and laughed loudly at a joke made by a very rich investor. Grant kissed Maya's cheek, completely acting like I didn't even exist anymore. I turned and walked toward the catering tent, making sure I looked like a servant with my eyes focused on the floor. I played the role of the broken, unstable dropout perfectly, but as I passed the large flower arches near the exit, I felt a heavy, steady gaze fixed right on me. It was not the mean stare of a rich guest or the cruel look from my parents. It was something entirely different, something sharp, smart, and really dangerous to the lies my family had built. Hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next part. Now this is where it gets interesting. David, Maya's father, stepped right out of the crowd and into my path. He moved with the quiet power of a man who had spent his whole life hunting bad guys in the dark. He was a retired federal agent, a man whose job was built on finding the ugly truths that wealthy people paid millions to keep hidden. He did not look at me with that annoying pity or treat me like a common stain on the rug. Instead, he reached into his suit pocket, pulled out a clean white handkerchief, and held it out toward my hands. I stopped, my gut screaming at me to keep my head down and walk away. Talking to guests was strictly forbidden by Margaret, and I knew I'd be locked in the basement for days. But David did not move. He stood there like a stone mountain, offering the cloth with a silent demand that I could not ignore. I slowly raised my head to tell him no. For the first time all evening, I looked a guest right in the eye. David locked his gaze onto mine, and in that split second, the whole party seemed to stop. I watched the calm mask of the retired agent finally crack. He froze. The breath caught in his chest and his wide shoulders went totally stiff. Which part of this surprised you most? Drop it in the comments. He wasn't looking at the bloody cuts on my hands or the cheap champagne soaking into my uniform. Instead, he was staring straight into my eyes with an intensity that made my heart hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird. You see, I have this incredibly rare genetic mutation called central heterochromia. My irises are a pale, almost see-through green, but right around the pupil is a jagged, bright, sapphire blue ring. It's a total anomaly, a glitch in nature. Margaret always forced me to hide it behind thick glasses or by keeping my eyes glued to the floor, calling it a freakish defect that people shouldn't see. But to a retired federal agent, this wasn't a defect. It was a biological fingerprint that was impossible to forge. If you think that's wild, wait until you hear why he recognized me. If you're enjoying the mystery so far, smash that like button for me. I could see the rapid-fire calculations happening behind his dark eyes as he started making connections that were supposed to stay buried forever. 30 years ago, long before he became a famous security consultant, he was a young, hungry agent assigned to the biggest unsolved mystery in the country, the Bancroft family fire. It was a tragedy that gripped the whole nation. A billionaire couple died in a massive, terrifying fire at their high-tech estate, leaving a global fortune in total limbo. Their 4-year-old daughter, the only surviving heiress to that massive empire, vanished into the smoke without a single trace. The only other people who disappeared that night were 2 newly hired caretakers who didn't have papers. That little girl was famous for one very specific thing, a sapphire ring circling a pale green pupil. They were the exact same eyes staring back at him right now. Now this is where it gets really interesting. David wasn't looking at a clumsy broken maid anymore. He was looking at a ghost who had just stepped out of a cold case file. He glanced over at Andrew and Margaret, who were busy entertaining tech investors in the courtyard. He was analyzing their features, comparing them to the 30-year-old suspect's sketches locked deep in his memory. The realization that the missing caretakers looked just like my supposed parents hit him like a physical punch to the gut. The pieces of a dark, sinister puzzle were finally slamming together. Just as Margaret noticed us and started marching toward the archway with pure fury, David flipped a switch. He used every bit of his decades of undercover training to instantly hide his shock. In a heartbeat, the intense investigator vanished, replaced by the jolly loud father of the bride. He let out a booming laugh that echoed off the stone walls and actually made Margaret stop in her tracks. "What a night this has been," David announced, his voice dripping with a forced, sugary warmth. "We absolutely have to capture these behind-the-scenes moments of such a beautiful wedding. Everyone is being way too serious today. Let's get a quick photo for the memory book before you run off to clean yourself up. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you don't miss the next part of this story." Before I could even think of a protest or Margaret could reach us to drag me away, David stepped right up beside me. He raised his heavy smartphone, pointing the high-resolution lens directly at my face. He didn't bother framing the beautiful flower arches or the golden sunset behind us. He angled the camera and zoomed in tight, specifically targeting the unique colors in my eyes. The harsh white flash went off, blinding me for a second, but it captured the irrefutable evidence he needed. "Thank you so much, my dear," David said smoothly. He lowered the phone, his big smile never wavering, even though his eyes remained sharp and dangerous. "Which part of this discovery is the most shocking to you? Let me know in the comments." Margaret finally reached us, her chest heaving with a rage she could barely contain. Wait until you see how fast a family turns into a pack of wolves when their biggest secret is about to be exposed. Margaret grabbed my arm so hard her fingernails sank right into my bruised skin, making me wince. She spoke to David in a fake, polite voice, dripping with venom. She apologized for my intrusion and promised she would handle me immediately since I belonged in the kitchen. David didn't seem upset at all. He just gave a polite nod and a sharp smile. "If you're enjoying this so far, smash that like button." David told her not to worry about it, saying it was a stressful day for everyone. He said he needed to step away to call a relative who missed the wedding. He turned around and walked toward a quiet corner of the gardens, far away from the noise of the party. I watched him go as Margaret dragged me to the catering tent and shoved me through the swinging doors. But here is where it gets interesting. Through a tiny glass window in the door, I kept my eyes on David. He reached the edge of the property, far from anyone who could hear him. He pulled out his phone and dialed a private number. His whole body went stiff with urgency. He spoke quietly to someone he obviously trusted from his past. He told them to pull the Bancroft file from 30 years ago. He wanted facial recognition and DNA markers checked immediately. He whispered into the phone, "I think I just found her." The fancy wedding reception lasted for hours, stretching way past midnight. I was trapped in the sweltering heat of that catering tent, washing hundreds of crystal glasses and scrubbing giant industrial pans until my fingers were raw and bleeding. I was exhausted, but my mind was racing. I kept seeing the way David stared at me. I knew something huge and terrible was coming. I could feel the panic in the air every time Andrew and Margaret walked past the kitchen doors, whispering to each other. They were losing control. My mistake in front of the guests had brought too much attention to the girl they usually kept hidden in the shadows. Now, hit subscribe and tap that bell so you don't miss what happens next. Suddenly, the heavy kitchen door swung open with a bang. Andrew and Margaret marched toward me with faces full of calculated rage. Before I could even put down my dish towel, Andrew grabbed me by the collar of my cheap uniform. He didn't say a single word to me. He just dragged me out the back exit and forced me down the stone steps toward the dark service driveway. The humid night air hit my face as I stumbled over the sharp gravel. Margaret followed right behind us, holding a velvet jewelry box tightly in her hands. Standing by a row of shiny black SUVs were Grant and Maya, getting ready to leave for their honeymoon. Grant looked annoyed by the delay, while Maya just looked exhausted. But all of that changed the second Margaret shoved me hard onto the pavement. "Look at her!" Margaret screamed, her voice cracking with a fake, theatrical sob. She claimed she caught me sneaking out of the bridal suite, trying to steal her own sister-in-law's diamonds. She flipped open the box to show a beautiful weight, until you hear the lies they started shouting the second that box was opened. "We fed her. We tried to fix her broken mind. And this is exactly how she repays our generosity, by stealing from our own family on your wedding night." Grant scoffed. He was shaking his head and letting out this big, fake sigh of disappointment. "I told you she was a massive liability," Grant said, putting his arm around Maya like he was protecting her. "We should have locked her away in a facility years ago. She's a total parasite." Maya looked down at me. Her sharp eyes were scanning everything, my bleeding hands, my bruised knees, and my soaked, dirty uniform. She looked at the diamond bracelet in Margaret's hands, then back to my face. I could see the gears turning in her head. She was smart enough to see that a greedy thief wouldn't be kneeling in the gravel looking like a battered prisoner. But she was newly married, surrounded by her husband's family, and she didn't understand the toxic mess she was standing in. She stayed completely silent, but her brow was furrowed with deep suspicion. If you're enjoying this story so far, smash that like button and let me know if you think Maya will speak up. Now here is where it gets even more insulting. "You are dead to us," Margaret hissed. She stepped so close I could smell the stale champagne on her breath. "You will never set foot in our house again. You are banished. Go rot in the gutter where you belong." She reached into her designer bag, pulled out a single crumpled $50 bill, and threw it right at my face. The green paper floated down and landed in the dirt next to my bleeding knees. "Get your garbage car off this property before I call the police and have you arrested for grand larceny," Andrew commanded. He turned his back on me and pushed Grant and Maya toward their waiting SUV. The heavy doors slammed shut, and just like that, my fate was sealed. I watched the red taillights disappear down the long, winding driveway, leaving me all alone in the darkness. But here's the crazy part. I wasn't done yet. I picked up the crumpled bill. It was the total value of my worth to them after 27 years of forced labor. I slowly stood up, my joints aching, and limped toward the service parking area. Hidden behind the big catering trucks was my car. It was a rusted, beat-up sedan that barely passed inspection. It was the only thing I was allowed to keep, and that was only so I could run their boring daily errands. I unlocked the creaking door and slid into the freezing driver's seat. My hands were shaking violently as I gripped the wheel, but I turned the key and drove out the massive iron gates of the estate. I was leaving my prison behind forever. Hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next part of this journey. I drove for miles without a destination, putting as much distance as I could between myself and that house. I eventually found a dark, empty parking lot behind an abandoned strip mall. The night temperature dropped fast, biting through the thin fabric of my uniform. I climbed into the back seat and pulled my bruised knees to my chest to stay warm. The wind howled against the cracked windows, turning the car into a freezing metal box. I was alone, homeless, broke, and branded a criminal by the only people I had ever known. Any normal person would have cried. Any normal person would have just given up. But I didn't shed a single tear. I laid my head against the cold seat and let my mind work through the logic. Andrew and Margaret had panicked. Which one surprised you most? Drop it in the comments. That champagne mess didn't just ruin a party, it put me right in the crosshairs of federal law enforcement. They were shaking in their boots, terrified that their dark secrets were about to be exposed by a retired agent who knew how to ask the right questions. Framing me for theft was just a lazy move to cut ties and bury evidence before anyone started poking around. They thought tossing me out into the freezing night would crush my spirit, and that taking away my tiny basement room would leave me totally helpless. But here's the crazy part. By kicking me out of their physical prison, they accidentally handed a master hacker the digital keys to the entire world. If you're enjoying this so far, smash that like button. I sat there with my eyes closed, picturing the command terminal on my secret server. That cold night wasn't the end. It was just the start of my revenge. A loud knock on my window shattered the silence and made me jump. My eyes snapped open, my heart thumping like a bird in a cage. My first terrifying thought was that Andrew had come to finish the job. I expected my father and some crooked cops to haul me away on fake charges. My hands balled into tight fists as I got ready for a fight. But the huge figure in the wind wasn't Andrew, it was David. He wore a heavy wool coat and didn't seem to care about the cold at all. He wasn't mad or smiling. His face was like a stone mask, the kind of look you get after years of dealing with the absolute worst situations imaginable. He raised a gloved hand and tapped the glass again, motioning for me to roll it down. But here's where it gets interesting. I was shaking as I turned the key just enough to move the window an inch. Icy air hit me, but he didn't blink. David didn't waste time with fake "how are you" talk or act sorry that my family had thrown me out like trash. He treated me with the serious respect you'd give a fellow soldier in a war zone. "Take this," David said, his deep voice cutting through the wind. He slid a thick, heavy folder through the gap, and it landed hard on my lap. The edges were worn out, and a big red stamp on the front said, heavily, redacted. But wait until you hear what he said next. Before I could even ask a question, David leaned down until his face was just inches from the glass. His dark eyes were locked onto mine with that same sharp look he had at the wedding. "Make sure you hit subscribe and tap that bell so you don't miss the next part. Read every word carefully, Elena," he told me. "Stop looking for the family you thought you had. Just look at the facts. I'm parked 3 spots behind you. Turn on your light and read. We're running out of time." He stepped back and vanished into the shadows, leaving me alone with that heavy envelope. I clicked on the dim light inside my beat-up car. My hands were still bleeding a bit from the broken champagne glasses, and I left small red smears on the paper as I pulled the folder open. You won't believe what happens next as the truth starts to come out. Which one of these secrets surprised you most? Drop it in the comments and share this with a friend. The sharp, unmistakable smell of old paper and stale ink filled the small cabin. At the top was a scanned copy of a federal report from nearly 30 years ago. The header read, "Bancroft Family Estate, Fire and Missing Persons Investigation." I forced my brain to stay focused, reading the file with the same cold logic I used when hunting for weak spots in corporate firewalls. The report described a massive suspicious fire that destroyed a famous coastal mansion. The victims were Richard and Eleanor Bancroft, a billionaire couple whose fortune came from global real estate and tech. But here is the crazy part. The investigators didn't think it was an accident. They called it total sabotage. Someone had poured chemicals at every exit, trapping the couple inside their bedroom. Their bodies were found in the ashes, and their empire was left in a total legal mess. If you're enjoying this mystery, smash that like button and let me know. But the tragedy didn't stop with the fire. I turned the page and suddenly it felt like all the air had been sucked out of my lungs. The next document was a missing child alert from the FBI. It gave details about the disappearance of the couple's only heir, a 4-year-old girl. She had vanished from the estate on the night of the fire, and they couldn't find any trace of her in the ruins. Under the bold text was a grainy digital photo of the child. I stared at that image, and a wave of dizziness hit me like a physical blow. The little girl had dark hair and a serious, quiet look on her face, but it was the medical notes under the photo that made my blood turn to ice. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The report said the child had a very rare genetic eye condition called central heterochromia. Her irises were pale green, but they were surrounded by a bright, unmistakable ring of sapphire blue. My breathing got thin and shaky. I slowly looked up at the rearview mirror, tilting it down to catch the dim light from the car's ceiling. Staring back at me were those exact same pale green eyes, circled by those sharp, jagged rings of sapphire blue. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. That weird defect Margaret always told me to hide behind thick glasses wasn't a flaw at all. It was a billion-dollar biological fingerprint. Make sure you hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next part of this story. My hand shook as I flipped to the last part of the folder. This section was labeled Primary Suspects. The report said the girl wasn't the only one missing. The Bancrofts had recently hired caretakers for the property. They also vanished into thin air the night of the fire, leaving behind no address, no bank history, and no explanation. Now this is where things get truly chilling. Taped to the suspect file were 2 black and white photos from their job applications. I stared at the grainy, high-contrast images, and my heart nearly stopped. The man in the photo had a sharp, arrogant jaw and cold, calculating eyes. Imagine looking at a grainy old photo and realizing your entire life was a lie designed by the people you called parents. Even with the bad image quality, the bone structure was a perfect match. It was them, a young Andrew and a young Margaret. In that second, the entire framework of my reality shattered. I wasn't some unwanted girl who was lucky to be a servant. I wasn't a burden to a wealthy family. I was a kidnapped child. They didn't take me in out of kindness. They stole me. They kept me in a dark basement and told the world I was crazy just to control me. Every cruel punishment and every lie was a strategy to keep a stolen billionaire heiress from finding out the truth. If you're enjoying this so far, smash that like button. I shut the file, my heart beating a dangerous rhythm against my ribs. I looked in the rearview mirror, and the scared, submissive girl I used to be was gone. The maid who did whatever she was told had vanished. Instead, the real heir to the Bancroft empire was looking back at me, her blue eyes shining with a deadly focus. I grabbed my old battered laptop bag, which was the only thing I saved before Andrew kicked me out. I walked through the freezing wind toward David's car. He was standing by the door, watching me as I got closer. He didn't ask if I'd read the file or how I was feeling. He just unlocked the door and gestured for me to get in. I climbed into the warm leather seat, hugging my bag tight. David started driving, leaving my old life behind in the dark. The drive was silent. I watched the streetlights flash by, letting the truth sink into my bones. Most people would have probably broken down, but those years in the basement had made me tough. I wasn't a crying maid anymore. I was a kidnapped heir, and the people who stole my life were sleeping in a mansion paid for by my inheritance. But here's the crazy part. We weren't just going to hide. We were going to take it all back. "We need absolute proof now," David said as he steered the car onto the highway. He explained that a photo and an old file wouldn't be enough to win in court or freeze their assets. He had a contact at a secret lab that worked 24 hours a day for high-profile clients who needed to stay hidden. We were going to get my DNA tested immediately. I just nodded, liking his focus on facts instead of feelings. Hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. About 20 minutes later, we pulled up to a sleek glass building in a quiet industrial park. David didn't even use the front desk. He used a special key card to lead me through a side door. A technician in clean medical scrubs met us with a silent nod. He led us into a bright, sterile room for the exam. The process was incredibly fast. The technician took a quick swab from the inside of my cheek, sealed it in a vial, and promised the results would be sent to David's secure server in a few hours. Now this is where it gets even more interesting. We were so close to the truth that I could almost taste it. David and I moved to a private waiting area down the hall. He paced around, speaking softly in Russian into his phone, likely talking to his old federal contacts. I sat down on a hard leather sofa, staring at the floor. Which part of this discovery surprised you most? Drop it in the comments. The shock from earlier was totally gone, replaced by a cold, sharp focus, and I was done playing the victim. I had the skills to start this war right now, and I wasn't waiting for anyone's permission. If you're rooting for the underdog, smash that like button right now. I unzipped my bag, pulled out my laptop, and powered it up. I connected to my own private, super secure hotspot, and the pale blue glow of the screen hit my face. It was a familiar, comforting feeling that helped me clear my head. I opened my hidden command terminal, and for just a second, my fingers hovered over the keys. Then I started typing faster than most people can think. For 10 years, whenever Andrew gave me a broken hard drive, or Grant aggressively demanded I fix his crashed servers, they thought they were just using me for free labor. They never realized they were handing a master lockpick the blueprints to their entire digital vault. Every time I fixed a device, updated a network, or set up a new smartphone for my golden child brother, I quietly built invisible backdoors into the systems. I created ghost admin accounts that didn't show up on any registry. I wrote silent protocols that gave me total access to every single piece of tech the family owned. But here is the crazy part. While they were playing at being tech giants, I was the one who actually owned the ground they stood on. Hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next part of this story. Now, sitting in that quiet clinical waiting room, I finally unleashed the full force of my hidden arsenal. I went straight for Grant's massive tech startup. His company was worth over $1 billion, and it was protected by top-tier security firms. I started a massive untraceable hack, sending in a custom payload that slipped right past his expensive firewalls. The security systems didn't even realize someone was there because they recognized my access codes as the creator. I bypassed his two-factor security instantly, mostly because I was the one who had secretly written the core algorithm that made it work. Within 90 seconds, I was inside the private parts of his company's network. I skipped the marketing databases and employee files. I went right for the heart of his empire, the private financial servers and the secret executive ledgers. Now this is where it gets really interesting. I needed to find the money trail. I had to see exactly how a guy with zero coding skills managed to get millions in funding to start a global tech firm. My screen was a blur of data moving through a dozen different proxy servers to hide my location. I started a mass download, grabbing gigabytes of secret banking info, private emails, and wire transfers. I pulled it all onto my own encrypted drive. Then I opened the master financial ledger. My eyes moved fast, scanning the glowing columns of numbers and hidden account names. I started tracing the initial investments backward, untangling a messy web of shell companies and blind trusts designed to hide the real source of the money. The money didn't come from normal investors in Silicon Valley. Instead, it was coming from a hidden source that changed everything. I kept digging, pushing deeper into the messy financial web my brother used to build his fake success. I was looking for the proof that would bring his stolen kingdom crashing down tonight. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I was using advanced search tools I'd written years ago specifically to track dirty money. I moved through the computer network like a ghost walking through walls I had built myself. The heavy firewalls he relied on were useless because I had the master key. This digital trail was hidden very well. Grant told the public his money came from a group of rich investment firms in London and Dubai. I pulled up the fancy investor slides from his website and compared them to the secret internal books. It was a total lie. The companies he listed didn't even exist. They were just phantom names registered to empty mailboxes in tax havens. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the digital underworld, make sure to hit that like button right now. I broke through another wall of security, forcing the system to show me the real bank numbers. The money had moved through a crazy maze of offshore accounts. It was jumping from one fake company to another to hide where it came from before landing in Grant's company bank. It was a high-end money laundering operation, but these people made a huge mistake. They didn't realize the person who built their network was the one watching them. I started tracing the main offshore account back to the start, peeling away the layers of fake owners. I ignored the dummy names in Cyprus and the fake companies in the British Virgin Islands. My screen was flashing fast as I broke the last wall, and then I saw the name of the person who owned the account. But here is where things get truly insane. The name staring back at me wasn't some rich tech guy or a foreign mystery man. It was Andrew. My heart started thumping in my chest as I looked closer. Andrew was linked to dozens of these other offshore companies. I checked the payment history for the main account, and everything lined up perfectly with Grant's fake career. Every time Grant needed $1 million for a fancy office, a wire transfer from Andrew arrived 12 hours before. When Grant needed cash to fake his user numbers and trick the news, the money came from that same hidden spot. My own father was paying for everything. This story is about to take a massive turn, so hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next part. But wait, Andrew was just a regular guy. He always complained about bills and used coupons to save money. There was no way he had enough cash to start a billion-dollar tech company. I pushed harder, searching for where Andrew was getting his money from. I finally cracked the last layer of security and found the original bank. It was a super private, elite bank in Geneva, Switzerland. When I saw the account details, I literally stopped breathing for a second. This money wasn't from good business deals or the stock market. It was coming from a massive, locked-down financial fund. It was an irrevocable generational trust. Which part of I stared at the name on that screen, and my heart nearly stopped. The Bancroft Family Primary Beneficiary Trust. The truth hit me with the force of a freight train. Andrew and Margaret didn't just save me from a fire 30 years ago. They stole my entire identity, my future, and my birthright. It's wild when you think about it. The massive fortune currently paying for my brother's luxury life, his fancy suits, and his fake company was actually my money. They kept me locked in a gross, wet basement and treated me like a worthless servant, all while they were stealing millions from my dead parents' estate to build a perfect life for their favorite child. The level of betrayal here was just insane. Every mean thing Margaret ever said, every time Andrew made me scrub their floors, they knew the whole time that I legally owned the very ground they were walking on. If you're enjoying this journey toward justice so far, smash that like button right now. I sat back on the stiff leather sofa, the glow from the laptop screen showing the cold, hard truth of my life. I finally had the digital proof. I had the bank numbers, the forged lists, and the evidence of their massive crimes. I saved everything to my secret drive, locking away the weapon I was going to use to destroy them. But here's the crazy part. Just as the secure transfer finished, a loud chime broke the silence of the room. I looked up. David was standing by the window with his government phone. He looked at the screen, his face turning very serious. He scanned the message, then slowly looked up at me. The air in that small room felt so thick you could cut it with a knife. It felt like a 30-year-old mystery was finally coming to an end. David walked toward me, his heavy footsteps echoing on the floor. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked down at the encrypted email that had just come in from the lab. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his cool. "We have the results," David said, his voice sounding heavy and final. He turned the phone around so I could see the text from the genetics lab. They had checked my DNA against the records for Richard and Eleanor Bancroft. The results were clear. The probability was 99.9%. There was no mistake. There was no way for Andrew and Margaret to lie about this ever again. The missing child case that had been open for 30 years was officially closed. Now, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the moment she finally confronts them. I'm looking at the only surviving heir to the Bancroft family, David said, looking at me with total respect. You aren't their servant, Elena. You're a billionaire. I closed my laptop with a loud, satisfying snap. The scared, lonely girl they had bullied for years was officially gone. I had the DNA proof of who I was, and I had the digital proof of their crimes. I stood up, feeling a dangerous, powerful calm wash over me. Now this is where it gets really interesting. I was ready to them. I was just a broken maid they tossed aside like trash in a freezing parking lot. But they had no idea I was about to set their entire fraudulent world on fire. David managed to find us a discreet, rundown motel on the outskirts of the industrial district so we could finally regroup. He needed some space to coordinate with his high-level federal contacts to make sure the case against the Grand Empire was airtight before we made a formal move. I sat there on the lumpy, stained mattress of room 12, watching my laptop run heavy encryption algorithms. I had to secure the massive mountain of data I just pulled from their secret offshore servers. If you're enjoying seeing these crooks finally get what's coming to them, smash that like button right now. But here's the terrifying part I didn't see coming. That huge digital heist I pulled triggered a silent secondary alarm hidden deep inside the network. Halfway across the state, Andrew's secure phone lit up with a critical breach notification that he couldn't ignore. For 30 years, he and Margaret had spent every moment protecting their stolen fortune, and they didn't leave their digital vaults unguarded. When Andrew saw where the hack originated, absolute panic set in. He knew I was the only person on the planet with the skills to bypass those specific, complex firewalls. But Andrew was a deeply paranoid and controlling man. Years ago, he had secretly installed a hardwired GPS tracker deep inside the frame of my rusted old car just to monitor my every move. He truly considered me his personal property, and he never let his property wander off unmonitored. He pinged the tracker and instantly saw my exact coordinates at that cheap roadside motel. Now this is where things take a very dark turn. Realizing their entire fake reality was just minutes away from being destroyed, Andrew and Margaret moved with desperate, ruthless speed. They didn't dare call the police because they knew any real investigation would expose their own massive crimes. Instead, they decided to use their wealth to organize a far more evil solution. Inside that dim motel room, the pale glow of my screen was the only light, showing the undeniable proof of my stolen birthright. I was busy turning those banking ledgers into a secure, automated dead man switch. If anything happened to me, the evidence would immediately be sent to every major news outlet and federal regulator in the country. David had just stepped out to his vehicle to get a secure satellite phone, warning me to keep the heavy deadbolt locked. Make sure you hit subscribe and tap that bell so you don't miss the moment they finally get caught. The early morning silence felt thick and heavy, like the calm before a storm. I took a deep breath, finally letting the reality of my true identity wash over me. I was Elena Bancroft. I was no longer a prisoner or a victim. I reached for my cup of cold coffee, feeling a deep sense of victory. But then, the violent sound of heavy tires screeching against loose gravel shattered the quiet dawn. Before I could even stand up, the flimsy wooden door buckled inward. The deadbolt snapped off the frame with a terrifying violent crack. Andrew stormed into the room, his face flushed with a scary mix of panic and pure malice. Margaret followed right behind him, already starting her fake, sobbing performance. Behind them stood a tall, sharply dressed man clutching a heavy black leather medical bag. I instantly slammed my laptop shut, throwing my body over it to protect the data. "Eleanor, my poor sick girl," Margaret wailed, pressing her hands to her face in a fake display of maternal agony. "Which part of this is the most twisted? Drop a comment below. They weren't just coming for my laptop. They were coming to erase my entire existence. We've been looking everywhere for you. We were so scared you'd hurt yourself in this state," Andrew shouted, his voice full of fake concern as he blocked my only way out through that broken door. He turned to the man with the medical bag, pointing at me. "We told you she was having another bad episode," Andrew lied. "She completely lost it at the wedding, screaming about stolen jewelry, and now she's hiding in this disgusting motel. She's totally out of her mind." My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard it hurt. "You're not getting this laptop," I told them, trying to keep my voice calm. "I know everything. I know about the offshore accounts and the Bancroft Trust." Margaret let out a loud, fake gasp and grabbed the doctor's arm. "See, Dr. Thorne," she cried, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She's completely lost touch with reality. She's been having these crazy delusions for months. She actually thinks she's some kidnapped billionaire heiress. It's a total psychotic break. If this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. But wait until you see how deep this corruption actually goes." Dr. Thorne stepped toward me, his eyes cold and empty. He didn't look like a doctor. He looked like a hitman in a lab coat. It was obvious Andrew was paying him a fortune to sign away my human rights without even asking me a single medical question. Andrew had used his stolen wealth to buy a professional who didn't care about the truth. Thorne didn't even look at me. He just pulled a pre-filled legal document from his briefcase. "This behavior is incredibly dangerous," Andrew said, taking a scary step toward the bed. "She's been hacking into her brother's company to destroy his life. We had to get emergency help before she causes real damage to herself or others. Make sure to subscribe and tap that bell so you don't miss the next part of this crazy journey." Now this is where it gets truly terrifying. I realized with absolute horror what they were doing. This wasn't just a fight about money. It was a perfectly planned ambush to make my evidence worthless. If they could legally label me as insane, then every secret I found about the Bancroft fortune would be dismissed as the ramblings of a crazy person. Dr. Thorne signed the bottom of the paper with a quick, careless flick of his pen. "Based on the family's testimony and the patient's clear state of delusion, I'm ordering an immediate involuntary psychiatric hold," the doctor said in a flat, boring voice. "She needs to be isolated for aggressive treatment." He reached into his black bag and pulled out a heavy syringe. The needle sparkled under the dim motel light. They were going to drug me, hide me away, and silence the true Bancroft heir forever. Section 9. 1,000 words. I lunged forward, throwing my whole body across the mattress to reach my laptop. If I could just hit the enter key, the files would be sent to David and the authorities instantly. But Andrew was faster, fueled by the panic of a man about to lose everything he stole. He grabbed me by my hair and yanked me backward with brutal force. I felt my scalp burn as I kicked and thrashed, clawing at his expensive suit like a trapped animal. Margaret shrieked, backing against the doorframe to stay away from the fight. Which one of them is the most evil? Let me know in the comments. I thought I could fight my way out of that motel room, but I had no idea how far they were willing to go to stop me. "Hold her down right now!" Andrew roared, his voice booming in the tiny space as he pinned my shoulders hard against the scratchy motel carpet. I fought back with everything I had, scratching and clawing at him like my life depended on it. But Dr. Thorne didn't seem bothered at all. He just stepped forward like he was a cold machine, totally calm while I was losing my mind. He pulled the cap off a heavy, thick syringe and shoved the needle straight into the side of my neck. I felt a sharp, agonizing sting, and then a wave of freezing liquid fire started rushing through my veins. It was terrifying how fast the drugs worked. Within seconds, my arms and legs felt like they were made of heavy, useless lead. My frantic kicking slowed down until it was just a few weak twitches. The world started to fade away as my vision narrowed into a dark, blurry tunnel. I desperately tried to scream for David or the man waiting in the car outside, but my jaw just went totally limp. I couldn't make a sound. Only a tiny, pathetic little gasp came out of my mouth. But here is the crazy part. They weren't just taking me, they were taking my only way to fight back. Andrew reached right over my paralyzed body and grabbed my laptop from the bed. He slammed the screen shut with a loud, violent crack, and the soft blue light disappeared instantly. The room was plunged into total darkness. My heavy eyelids finally shut, and the last thing I felt was Andrew's hands grabbing my ankles. He started dragging my helpless, drugged body across the rough carpet and out into the freezing cold dawn. If you're enjoying this intense story so far, make sure to smash that like button and let me know what you think of Andrew's move. I spent what felt like forever floating in a thick chemical fog where time didn't exist. Little broken memories started to poke through the heavy darkness in my mind. I remember the loud, aggressive rumble of a transport van and the harsh, bright glare of streetlights passing by. I remember the scary feeling of being carried through long, echoing hallways by hands I didn't recognize. When I finally forced my heavy eyes to open, I was blinded by rows and rows of humming fluorescent lights. The air was thick with the smell of bleach and that sharp, gross clinical antiseptic they use in hospitals. I tried to sit up, but my muscles were screaming in protest. They felt weighed down by the powerful sedative they had pumped into me. Now this is where it gets really interesting, and honestly, pretty terrifying. I was lying on a thin plastic mattress that was bolted directly to the center of the cold floor. When I looked down, I realized my clothes were completely gone. The nice, tailored suit David had given me was gone, replaced by a stiff, pale green hospital gown that scratched aggressively against my skin every time I moved. Panic started to surge through my chest, hot and violent. I started patting down the thin fabric of the gown, looking for any way to contact the outside world, but my phone was gone. My heavily encrypted laptop was gone. My keys, my ID, and the folder with my true family history had all been taken away. If you want to see how I tried to get out of this mess, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next part. This sterile room was a perfect scary cage. There were absolutely no windows to tell me if it was day or night. The walls were painted a thick, boring white that had no texture or color at all. The only way out was a heavy steel door with a tiny pane of shatterproof glass. High in the corner of the ceiling, a black security camera hummed quietly. Its little red light was blinking like a malicious eye, following every single move I made. They had stripped me of my digital weapons and cut me off from the power I usually had behind a keyboard. I was totally disconnected from David, isolated from the police, and trapped in a high-tech nightmare. You won't believe what happened when I finally tried to stand up. I stumbled off the plastic mattress, my bare feet slapping against the freezing linoleum floor. I marched toward the heavy steel door and started slamming my fists against the glass. I pounded on the metal frame, putting every bit of my weight into every single hit. "Let me out of here!" I shouted, my voice cracking because of the drugs. "I'm being held here against my will. Call the police. I need to make a federal phone call right now." Suddenly, the heavy locks on the outside of the door clicked loudly. A huge male orderly stepped into the room, followed closely by a nurse who was holding a digital tablet. She didn't look worried about my screaming at all. Which part of this escape plan do you think she should try first? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let me know. Imagine being trapped in a room where every single word you say to prove your sanity only makes you look more insane. The nurse looked completely bored, like she'd seen this 1,000 times. "Elena, you need to lower your voice and get back into your bed right now," she ordered. Her voice was filled with that fake, patronizing authority that makes your skin crawl. "You are having a very serious manic episode, and if you keep acting aggressive, we will have to use more sedation on you." I took a step back, forcing myself to breathe deeply. "My name is not Elena," I told her, my hands shaking so much I had to grip the edge of the mattress to stay steady. "I am Bancroft. I was kidnapped 30 years ago. The people you think are my parents are actually criminals running a money laundering scheme using my stolen trust fund. You need to call a retired FBI agent named David immediately." The nurse just gave me a tight, condescending smile while she tapped away at her digital tablet. "Your parents specifically warned us about this exact delusion," she said smoothly. "They explained that your condition makes you believe you're some kind of missing billionaire heiress. It's a textbook case of schizophrenia. They love you very much, Elena. They are paying a massive amount of money to make sure you get the absolute best psychiatric care possible. We're just here to keep you safe from your own dangerous hallucinations. If you're enjoying this so far, smash that like button." But here's the crazy part. The nightmare was only just beginning. She turned around and walked out, and the big orderly followed her before pulling the heavy steel door shut. The locks engaged with a loud, heavy echo that felt final. I was left alone in that blindingly white room. Suddenly, claustrophobia hit me like a ton of bricks. It felt like I couldn't breathe. This place was literally built to make me look crazy. Every single thing I said would just be recorded as a symptom of my madness. I was a master of the digital world, but in this cage, I was completely powerless. I sank down onto the freezing floor and buried my face in my hands. The reality of being totally isolated finally broke me. I thought I was at rock bottom, but then the door opened again. Barely an hour went by before I heard those heavy deadbolts moving with a loud metallic clank. I scrambled backward, pressing my back against the cold concrete wall as the door swung open. The big orderly stepped in first to clear the room, and then Margaret walked in. She looked totally out of place in a sterile cell. She was wearing a fancy red dress, her hair was done perfectly, and a heavy diamond bracelet was sparkling on her wrist. It was the same bracelet she'd accused me of stealing just a day ago. Hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. She stood in the middle of the room, looking down at my bare feet and my scratchy green hospital gown with a look of pure satisfaction. She waved her hand at the guard like he was a servant. "Leave us," she commanded. He didn't even blink. He just stepped out and let the automatic locks click shut. Now, it was just the two of us. Margaret didn't even try to keep up the sad mother act she used at the motel. That fake crying was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating monster I knew. She crossed her arms and gave me a sharp, predatory smile. "You've always been a surprisingly tough little roach," she said, her voice sounding like ice against the walls. "I'll give you credit for that. You just don't know when to quit. Wait until you hear the twisted reason why she kept me alive for 30 long years. You survived that damp basement, you survived our strict rules, and somehow you lived long enough to snoop into money matters that have absolutely nothing to do with you." I glared up at her, refusing to let her see how much my heart was racing. "It has everything to do with me because it's my life," I snapped back. "I know exactly who you are, Margaret. I read the federal file. I know you and Andrew were just the newly hired staff. And I know you're the one who set the fire that murdered my parents." Margaret didn't even blink. She just let out a harsh, cold laugh. "If you're enjoying this story so far, smash that like button. Don't give Andrew too much credit for that night," she sneered. "He was far too much of a coward to actually strike the match. I handled the gas myself. I poured it along the floorboards and watched the flames crawl up the main staircase of the Bancroft estate. It was a beautiful, necessary way to start over. But here is where it gets truly dark." She started pacing across the room, her heels clicking loudly on the hard floor. "We never even wanted to take you," she said, looking down at me with disgust. "You were just a whiny, demanding 4-year-old who cried all the time, but you were the only key to a massive financial empire. We had to keep you alive until you served your purpose. So we dragged you out the service entrance, changed your name, and shoved you into the dark. We fed you scraps and forced you to fix Grant's computers because it kept you quiet and useful. You were never a beloved daughter to us. You were just a long-term investment, like property we kept locked up until the market was finally ready for us to cash in. Now this is where things get really interesting." Her words were meant to break my spirit, but my brain was already looking for a way out. I was focused on the info she was giving away. "You could have killed me years ago and tried to claim the money through legal loopholes," I said, watching her face for any reaction. "But you kept me hidden for 30 long years. Why go through all that trouble?" Margaret stopped walking and leaned down, bringing her face just inches from mine. "Because your father, Richard Bancroft, was a paranoid man," she whispered. "He didn't just lock his wealth behind normal bank rules. He set up an impenetrable trust that was locked by time. $250 million waiting in a high-security account that we couldn't touch without setting off every federal alarm in the country. Make sure you hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next part." We siphoned off some cash from offshore shell companies to build Grant's tech company. "Sure," she continued. "But the real prize, the big vault, has been sitting out of our reach for 3 decades. I stared at her, finally putting the last pieces of the puzzle together. "They don't just want my money, they need my actual body to unlock the vault." Margaret explained that they require a live retinal scan of my eyes and a verified thumbprint for their digital ledger. They already have the machine and the secure link to the bank ready to go. All they're missing is the physical keys, which are my own body parts. Since I've been so difficult to work with, they've decided to take me out of the equation and change their entire approach. Dr. Thorne has authorized a brutal, aggressive schedule of medications to keep me down. For the next 3 days, I'm going to be heavily sedated, floating in a deep chemical fog that makes me completely easy to handle. On the morning of my birthday, Andrew will walk into this room with that biometric scanner. I'll be too drugged to fight, too weak to even blink my eyes shut, and too paralyzed to pull my hand away. They'll press my thumb to the glass and scan my eyes while I lay there helpless. Once the money is safe, Dr. Thorne will report that his severely ill patient had a fatal medical event in her cell. If you're enjoying this so far, smash that like button. Margaret gave me one last smug look and a nasty smile. Enjoy your final 3 days, Elena, she sneered. She turned and knocked on the heavy steel door. The guard opened it immediately, and she stepped out into the bright hallway without looking back. The locks clicked into place with a heavy sound that echoed through the room, leaving me alone in the freezing silence. I was left with nothing but a horrifying countdown running in my head. I had 3 days until they stole everything I own, and 3 days until they murdered me. I looked at the security camera blinking in the corner, and my panic turned into a cold, sharp rage. I had 72 hours to break out of an impossible fortress, and I knew I was going to need a weapon. Hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next part of this escape. But here is the crazy part. I knew physical force was useless against armed guards. My weapon has always been my mind, and to use it, I had to play a very dangerous game. When the door opened an hour later, Dr. Thorne and a big orderly came in with the first dose of their chemical cocktail. Instead of fighting them like I usually did, I went completely limp. I let my shoulders drop and made my eyes look like I couldn't focus on anything. When the doctor walked up with the pills, I didn't scream or struggle. I just opened my mouth like a good little prisoner. I hid the pills way back under my tongue, a trick I learned years ago to survive when Margaret drugged me in the basement. I swallowed the water and showed them my empty mouth so they wouldn't suspect a thing. The second they turned their backs to write on their tablets, I coughed the wet pills into the sleeve of my rough hospital gown. Now, this is where it gets interesting. For the next 48 hours, I became a master at acting like a total zombie. I dragged my feet when they moved me and let a little drool hit my collar to make it look real. I just stared at the white walls, pretending I couldn't hear a word they said. The staff got bored of watching me pretty quickly. I wasn't a flight risk anymore. I was just another drugged-up patient taking up space. Because I seemed so broken, they finally started to relax their rules. On the morning of my 3rd day, the day before my 34th birthday, they decided I was calm enough to go to the recreation room for yard time. You won't believe what happens next. Which part of the plan was the smartest? Drop it in the comments. The recreation room was a sad, hollow space with linoleum floors and plastic chairs bolted into the ground. But I wasn't there to relax. The air smelled like stale coffee and the harsh chemical cleaners they use in hospitals. Other patients were shuffling around aimlessly or staring blankly at a TV screen locked behind thick, reinforced glass. I moved slowly toward a group of chairs in the back corner, keeping my head down like I had completely given up. But while I looked defeated, my eyes were scanning the ceiling at high speed. I was mapping out the entire security grid. There were 4 rotating cameras mounted in the corners of the room, and I watched their movements closely, calculating the exact timing of when their paths crossed. I noticed a major flaw in the room's design. A huge concrete pillar near the back emergency exit created a tiny, triangular blind spot. If I sat perfectly still, with my back against the wall, right where the pillar met the corner, the cameras wouldn't be able to see my hands at all. Now I just needed some hardware to work with. I shuffled over to a beat-up metal shelf filled with old magazines and board games with missing pieces. Tucked away behind a pile of torn puzzles, I found exactly what I was looking for. A bulky old AM/FM radio that ran on batteries. It looked totally dead and ignored by the lazy staff. I draped my hospital gown over my arm, swiped the radio off the shelf, and tucked it tightly against my ribs. But here is the crazy part. A simple radio receiver wasn't going to be enough to get my message out. To actually broadcast a digital signal, I needed a way to change the frequency. I needed a quartz crystal. I turned my empty blank gaze toward the nurse's station just outside the room. A young nurse had left her medical cart alone for just a split second while she turned her back to unlock a medicine cabinet. Sitting right there on the top tray was a basic digital thermometer. I dragged my bare feet across the floor, timing my walk perfectly with the camera's rotation. Just as the lens moved away, I bumped into the metal cart. In one smooth motion, I slid the thermometer down the neck of my gown. I mumbled a slurred apology as the nurse turned around, but she just shooed me away like a nuisance. If you're enjoying this high-stakes escape so far, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. I went straight back to that narrow blind spot behind the concrete pillar. I sat on the cold floor with my legs crossed, pulling my knees up high to hide my workspace from any wandering eyes. I took a long, deep breath to calm my nerves. My hands, which had been shaking for 2 days, suddenly became rock solid. I was back in my element. I used my fingernails to pry the plastic casing off the digital thermometer. Inside, I carefully pulled out a tiny silver quartz crystal oscillator. This little component usually just keeps the time for the thermometer screen, but in my hands, it was about to become the heartbeat of a secret transmission. Now this is where it gets interesting, because I was about to turn a piece of junk into a high-tech tool using nothing but my bare hands. Next, I cracked open the broken radio. The circuit board inside was dusty but still in good shape. I didn't even have to think. My hands moved on instinct, using years of engineering experience to change how the electricity flowed. A normal radio only catches waves, but I needed it to do the opposite. I pulled off the copper speaker wire and used my teeth to strip the insulation until the raw metal was showing. Then I rerouted the wiring directly from the battery pack to the tuning capacitor. I was basically flipping the entire power flow of the circuit board to make it work in reverse. By soldering that tiny quartz crystal from the thermometer right into the radio's main heart, I created a way to multiply the signal frequency. I found an old rusty paperclip stuck in the floorboards and used it to bridge the very last connection. Suddenly, the modified board started to hum softly in my hands. I had actually done it. I turned a piece of literal trash into a focused, short-wave transmitter. It was super unstable and would probably fry its own wires within a few seconds, but I didn't need it to last a long time. I just needed a tiny, microscopic window to shove a single packet of data through the airwaves. But here is the crazy part. A transmitter is totally useless if you don't have a bridge to the outside world. If you're enjoying this high-stakes breakdown so far, smash that like button for me. I closed my eyes and pictured the hospital's computer network in my head. I knew these big institutions usually relied on basic, poorly guarded Wi-Fi to manage patient files and talk to doctors outside. If I could boost my homemade signal just enough to catch their frequency, I could hitch a ride on their data stream. I gripped the messy circuit board tight against my chest, waiting for the exact moment the guards changed shifts. The clock was ticking down to my birthday, and I was about to fire a digital flare right into the federal database. The red clock above the doors flashed 3:15. This was the only moment the security was weak. I watched through a tiny gap between a pillar and the wall. The 2 guards turned their backs and walked toward the big steel doors to talk to the new guys. Those doors groaned open, creating a blind spot that I knew would last exactly 45 seconds. Now, this is where it gets really intense. I pushed myself off the freezing floor and moved with total precision. I slipped out from behind the pillar and stayed low to the ground. My target was the small glass booth next to the room. It was empty for now because the nurse had stepped out before the new shift took over. The door had an electronic keypad, but I was ready for it. Hit subscribe and tap the bell right now so you don't miss what happens in the next part. I pressed my DIY radio right against the magnetic lock and flipped the battery switch. The copper wires sparked and hissed. The quartz crystal inside surged with electricity, flooding the keypad with a massive burst of interference. The lock buzzed like crazy. The green light flashed in total confusion, and then the seal gave way with a soft click. I shoved the door open, slipped inside, and pulled it shut. On the desk was an open laptop. The screen was bright, showing an old patient portal. I sat in the chair, and the feel of the keys gave me a huge rush of adrenaline. I pulled up the Wi-Fi settings and found their network. It was so weak that a beginner could have hacked it in minutes. Which part of this escape surprised you the most? Drop it in the comments. With my background in how these buildings are put together, it was like walking through a gate that someone forgot to lock. I bypassed their internal security using a quick series of simple commands, instantly bumping my access up from a regular user to a full system administrator. Suddenly, the entire facility network was wide open for me to explore. I moved fast, finding the main patient list and searching for my specific room number. The system pulled up a massive file, and I clicked into the folder to see what was inside. If you're enjoying this high-stakes breakout so far, smash that like button. What I found was horrifying. Dr. Thorne had uploaded dozens of completely fake medical reports about me. These forged papers claimed I had violent outbursts and was suffering from extreme delusions about being a billionaire. It was a perfect example of medical gaslighting, specifically written to take away my legal rights so Andrew could take control of all my money. But here's the crazy part. I didn't let myself panic. I grabbed every single one of those fake records and got them ready to send out. Back at the motel, right before Andrew slammed my laptop shut, I had managed to hide my offshore banking records on a secret, encrypted server. I had already given David the key to that server. Now, I just needed to link the two pieces of evidence together. I opened a secure browser on the laptop and bounced my connection through 3 different remote servers to hide the hospital's location. I reached out across the internet and found my hidden cloud server. The connection was strong. I started a huge, high-speed data dump, sending the fake medical files directly into the secure folder I shared with David. At the same time, I ran a command to unlock the banking records and bundle them with the hospital documents. To make sure David knew exactly where I was being held hostage, I broke into the hospital's own mapping system. I took the exact GPS coordinates of the building and hid them inside the data I was sending. If you want to see how this ends, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next episode. Now, this is where it gets really intense. A progress bar appeared on the screen, showing how much data was moving. Through the glass walls of the room, I saw the new shift of guards walk into the area. One of them immediately saw the empty space behind the concrete pillar where I was supposed to be. He grabbed his radio, his head spinning as he searched the room. The second guard pointed his finger right at me in the observation booth. They started sprinting toward the glass door. I looked down at the screen, but the transfer was moving painfully slow. 70%. 80%. The sound of their heavy boots echoed against the floor as they got closer. I kept my eyes glued to that glowing green bar, wishing it would just finish. 85%. 90%. The first guard reached the door and yanked on the handle, but it was jammed. He started slamming his fist against the thick glass, screaming at me to get away from the computer. The second guard was shaking as he tried to find his master keycard. 95%. 98%. The lock beeped loudly as he swiped the card. The magnetic seal let go. 100%. The transfer complete message flashed on the screen just as the heavy door flew open and smashed against the wall. To see if I can actually make it out of the building now that they've caught me, you'll want to stick around for the next part. Which part of this plan would you have been most nervous about? Drop it in the comments. I didn't even flinch. With one lightning-fast tap of a key, I triggered the hard wipe protocol. All the data on that administrative laptop vanished instantly. I fried the system, leaving no trace of the secret message I'd just sent. The screen went pitch black right as a massive guard grabbed my shoulders and threw me backward onto the floor. 2 more guards stormed into the small booth and pinned my arms down against the cold linoleum. They were screaming for chemical restraints and immediate isolation, sounding totally panicked. I just let my body go completely limp. I didn't give them an ounce of physical resistance. I just stared up at the blank ceiling, feeling the cold floor pressing against my spine. They thought they'd successfully caught a dangerous, unstable patient who'd lost her mind. But here's the crazy part. They were way too late. If you're enjoying this high-stakes escape so far, smash that like button. The undeniable proof of my identity, the forged medical records, and the entire financial map of my brother's criminal empire were already sitting safely in the hands of David, a retired federal agent. The countdown to my birthday was still ticking, but the trap had officially been set. The guards hauled me up and dragged my limp body down those bright, sterile hallways. I kept my eyes half shut, pretending to be a broken woman. They tossed me back into my isolation cell and administered another dose of sedatives. I knew their routine. I hid the pill under my tongue and spat it out the moment the door clicked shut. Now this is where it gets interesting. I spent the next 48 hours in total silence. I just lay there, watching the clock as the minutes to my 34th birthday ticked away. Every time a nurse checked on me through the door, I stayed perfectly still. I was saving every bit of my energy, visualizing the data packet I had sent to David. I knew federal bureaucracy moved slowly, but David was a master at navigating those waters. He had everything he needed to take them down. He just needed enough time to call in the cavalry. Hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss a single second of the next part. The morning of my 34th birthday finally arrived, but there was no sunlight to mark the occasion in that dark room. The only way I knew my trust fund had officially unlocked was the harsh, grinding sound of the deadbolts moving outside my door. The steel barrier swung open, and there stood Andrew. He was wearing an expensive charcoal suit, looking completely out of place in this gross, sterile ward. Dr. Thorne and a burly guard were standing right behind him. Andrew was clutching a sleek silver briefcase in his left hand, and his face was flushed with the thrill of victory. He had spent 30 long years planning this exact moment, and he truly believed he had finally reached the finish line. Andrew stepped into the cell, his shoes clicking loudly on the concrete floor. "Happy birthday, Elena," he said, his voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. He told me I'd been a very difficult investment to manage. Andrew was seconds away from stealing my entire life as he reached for the retinal scanner, the device humming as the red laser came to life. He walked over to my bed with a look of pure, triumphant greed on his face. "You really thought you could outsmart me, didn't you?" he whispered, leaning in so close I could smell his breath. "To the world, you are nothing but a ghost, Eleanor. And after today, you are simply going to fade away." He grabbed my jaw with his rough hand, his fingers digging into my cheeks as he forced my head upward. He positioned the scanner over my face, but I kept my eyes squeezed shut. "Open your eyes, you ungrateful brat," he snarled. He let go of the device with one hand and used his thumb and forefinger to pry my right eyelid open. The red targeting laser pierced my vision, trying to lock onto the sapphire ring circling my pupil. I stared into the light, waiting for the system to beep. But wait until you see how this backfires. If you're enjoying this, smash that like button right now. Just as the device was about to confirm the scan, a deafening explosion shook the entire building. The heavy steel door of my cell didn't just slide open, it was violently blown off its reinforced hinges. The giant slab of metal crashed onto the floor, sending up a thick cloud of plaster dust. Before Andrew could even turn his head to see what was happening, the room was suddenly swarming with armed federal agents in tactical gear. "FBI, drop the device and put your hands on your head," a voice roared through the smoke. Andrew froze in place. The scanner slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered onto the concrete floor. The orderly, who had been pinning me down, immediately threw his hands up, backing away in surrender. Dr. Thorne tried to bolt, but 2 agents intercepted him, slamming him against the wall and securing his wrists in cuffs. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next part. David stepped through the settling dust, ignoring the panic erupting all around him. He marched directly toward Andrew. My uncle raised his hands, stammering about how this was all a misunderstanding and how he just had a sick daughter. David didn't waste a single breath on conversation. He grabbed Andrew by the lapels of his suit, lifted him off the ground, and slammed him brutally against the concrete wall. The impact knocked the wind out of Andrew, leaving him gasping for air as an agent immediately cuffed his wrists behind his back. David finally turned his attention to me. He stepped over the discarded scanner and extended his hand to help me up. The chaotic noise of the raid seemed to fade into the background. I looked at his outstretched hand, then up at his steady, unwavering gaze. I didn't need an orderly to lift me anymore, and I didn't need a doctor to assess my condition. I pushed myself up from the mattress, ignoring the lingering stiffness. I bypassed David's hand and planted my bare feet firmly on the cold floor. I stood up. I was the rightful heir to the Bancroft empire, and I was finally walking out of that asylum like a predator ready to hunt. But while I was stepping into the night, a completely different scene was unfolding on the other side of the city. Miles away from those shattered steel doors, the Grand Plaza Hotel was practically vibrating with fake excitement and aggressive corporate energy. Grant was hosting the official launch gala for his tech company's IPO, and it was a massive, expensive spectacle. The grand ballroom looked like a monument to all the wealth he had stolen, draped from floor to ceiling in black and gold silk. Hundreds of fancy crystal chandeliers lit up the room, casting a warm, golden glow over a sea of elite guests. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved smoothly through the crowd, carrying heavy silver trays filled with imported caviar and the finest vintage champagne. If you're enjoying this revenge story so far, smash that like button right now. The room was packed to the ceiling with hungry Wall Street investors, top tech journalists, and the absolute highest level of local society. Everyone there wanted a piece of Grant's highly anticipated unicorn startup. Huge digital screens wrapped around the entire ballroom, showing off the sleek company logo and a massive countdown clock. It was ticking down to the exact second the stock exchange would open the next morning. But here's the crazy part. Grant was standing right in the center of it all, practically glowing under the bright flashes of the press cameras. He was totally in his element, a polished fraud playing the role of a visionary genius to absolute perfection. He wore a custom-tailored velvet dinner jacket, shaking hands firmly and accepting praise from everyone. He posed for photos with powerful politicians and big-time banking executives, looking like a self-made titan. He was perfectly happy taking credit for a digital infrastructure that he didn't even fundamentally understand. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Standing near the edge of the main stage was Margaret. She had rushed to the hotel hours ago to oversee every little detail, completely unaware of the federal raid that was currently dismantling her life across town. Make sure you hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next part. Margaret wore a stunning, floor-length silver gown that was dripping with expensive diamonds. She was playing the part of the proud elite mother flawlessly. She smiled brightly for the photographers, clinging to the arms of wealthy venture capitalists and telling them made-up stories about Grant's childhood brilliance. But underneath that polished mask, Margaret was actually shaking with greedy anticipation. Her eyes kept darting toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the ballroom. She was desperately waiting for Andrew to show up. She fully expected him to walk through those doors at any moment and give her a small, triumphant nod. That nod would confirm that my forced retinal scan was finished and the $250 million Bancroft Trust Fund had been moved to their hidden offshore accounts. She could practically taste her permanent victory, but she was totally blind to reality. She had no idea that her husband was actually sitting in the back of a federal transport vehicle with his wrists locked in heavy iron cuffs. But wait until you see this. Standing rigidly right beside Grant and Margaret was Maya. Unlike all the fawning investors and the fake guests, the beautiful bride was not smiling at all. Which part of this takeover surprised you the most? Drop it in the comments and let me know. Maya, the sharp and brilliant sister-in-law, had been quietly watching all the glaring red flags in her new family ever since that brutal night I was kicked out in the driveway. While everyone else was celebrating, she stood there in a stunning crimson gown, her posture stiff and her eyes scanning the room for the truth. She held a glass of sparkling water, her dark, observant eyes analyzing every single person she talked to. Maya was a woman who valued integrity above everything else, and her intuition was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with the people she had just married into. If you're enjoying this deep dive so far, smash that like button and let me know you're watching. She started by watching Grant very closely. Every time a reporter tried to ask him a real technical question about the code behind his new software, he would just dodge it. Instead of giving specific details about the core architecture, he would smoothly switch to using empty marketing buzzwords and making vague promises about the future. He didn't sound like a brilliant engineer at all. He sounded like a slick salesman trying to hide something. But here's the crazy part. Grant wasn't the only one acting suspicious. Maya also noticed the nervous, predatory energy coming from Margaret. She watched as a society reporter bravely asked Margaret about her other daughter, bringing up the dramatic scene with the champagne at the wedding. Margaret didn't even miss a beat. She placed a manicured hand over her heart and told a perfectly practiced, sorrowful lie. She told the reporter that I was currently resting in a specialized luxury care facility, getting the best psychiatric treatment their money could buy. Maya heard the fake sadness in her voice, and her deep suspicion turned into cold, analytical certainty. Now, this is where it gets even more interesting. Maya's father, David, was nowhere to be seen on the most important night of her husband's career. She had checked her phone over and over for the past 2 hours, but he had only sent one secure text message earlier, saying he was handling a critical security matter and to trust him. David was a retired federal agent who never missed family milestones unless lives were actively on the line. His absence was like a loud alarm bell, signaling that a massive operation was happening behind the scenes. Hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the moment the truth finally comes out. The music in the ballroom slowly faded as the lights went down, signaling the start of the keynote presentation. A single bright spotlight hit the center of the stage, and the crowd went totally silent. Grant handed his champagne glass to a waiter and walked up the steps to the podium with his signature $1,000,000 smile. "Welcome, everyone," he announced, his voice booming through the massive sound system. "Tonight, we celebrate the absolute triumph of innovation, transparency, and the future." The irony of his words was so thick it was almost suffocating. The investors cheered like crazy, totally fooled by his act. Margaret was beaming in the front row, already spending the millions she thought were safe. Which part of this family's lies surprised you the most? Drop it in the comments. But just as the thunderous applause reached its peak, the whole room was suddenly shaken by a deafening crash. The massive mahogany doors at the back of the hall were kicked open with so much force they slammed against the paneled walls. The sound was like a bomb going off, and it vibrated right through the crystal chandeliers. That loud crashing noise cut through the polite corporate cheering like a physical blade. Hundreds of wealthy investors, reporters, and high society elites gasped all at once, their heads spinning around to see who was there. Grant was still standing at the podium, but his charming smile instantly turned into a look of total confusion. His hands gripped the edges of the wooden stand as his prepared speech completely died in his throat. Margaret stopped clapping mid-air, her hands just hanging there as the color drained from her perfectly contoured face. That greedy glow in her eyes was gone in a heartbeat, replaced by cold, creeping dread. The entire gala went dead silent, leaving nothing but the quiet hum of the giant digital screens overhead. If you're enjoying this, smash that like button and let me know in the comments. I didn't stay in the shadows. I stepped over the threshold and walked right into the center of the grand ballroom. I wasn't wearing that scratchy, cheap maid uniform anymore. I wasn't the invisible, broken girl they forced to scrub floors in a basement with no windows. Instead, I was wearing a razor-sharp charcoal power suit that showed everyone exactly who was in charge. The clean lines of the suit framed my posture, which was now perfectly straight and strong. My dark hair was pulled back in a sleek, severe style, leaving my face completely exposed to the flashing cameras. I walked with the steady, predatory stride of a woman who legally owned every single square inch of the empire they had built around her. I didn't bow my head or look away. I looked straight at the main stage, my pale green eyes burning under the lights. If you looked closely, you could see the unique, jagged rings of sapphire blue in my eyes. I was Elena Bancroft, the only surviving heir to a stolen dynasty, and I had come to collect my debts. But here's the crazy part. I didn't walk into that room by myself. On my right was David, who had traded his heavy wool coat for a sharp, tactical jacket. He moved with the commanding energy of a seasoned investigator, finally closing his biggest case. And surrounding us was a tight circle of heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical vests with bold yellow letters. Seeing a federal raid crash an elite corporate event sent a massive wave of panic through the wealthy crowd. Venture capitalists backed away in a hurry, clutching their champagne flutes like they were shields, terrified of being caught in the crossfire of a federal investigation. High-profile journalists didn't run, though. Their professional instincts kicked in, and they started snapping photos and recording every second of the disruption. The sound of the guests gasping filled the cavernous room, drowning out the ambient hum of the venue. Hit subscribe and tap the bell right now so you don't miss what happens when the feds take over. Now this is where it gets really interesting. Up on the stage, Grant finally managed to close his gaping mouth. His eyes darted wildly from the federal agents to my face, his brain completely unable to process the transformation he was seeing. He expected me to be a lobotomized patient rotting away in some isolated hospital cell. He definitely didn't expect the sister he had discarded to march into his kingdom, backed by the full weight of the federal government. Margaret was so shaken, she actually stumbled backward, her expensive designer heels catching on the carpet as she tried to get away from the sight of me. Wait until you see the look on her face when she realizes her world is about to explode. If you're enjoying this takedown so far, smash that like button for me. She was clutching her expensive diamond necklace so tight I thought it might snap, her mouth hanging open like a fish as she looked around for Andrew. She had no idea her husband was already in the back of a federal van, headed for a jail cell. Maya was standing right there too, her eyes darting between the tactical team and her father. When David gave her that one firm nod from across the room, you could see the weight lift off her shoulders. She wasn't defensive anymore. She finally knew the truth. Just then, a group of huge security guards in dark suits tried to block our path. They were acting all tough, demanding to see our invitations like they actually had power. But I didn't even slow down. I wasn't about to waste my breath arguing with some hired muscle. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my phone. My hands were perfectly steady as I unlocked the screen. While Grant was busy playing celebrity, shaking hands and smiling for the cameras all week, I had been doing something much more productive. I had buried myself deep inside his company's servers, hiding in the code where no one would ever look. I'd built a secret master override, a digital kill switch, that was completely invisible to his tech team. They thought their firewalls were unhackable, but they were wrong. I found the final command on my screen and tapped it. But here's the crazy part. The second I hit send, the entire room changed. Everything happened at once. Every giant digital screen in that massive ballroom started to glitch and flicker simultaneously. Those fancy corporate logos Grant loved so much were jumping all over the place. The big countdown clock for the stock exchange just froze in place. Then a loud, piercing shriek of static blasted through the speakers, making all these wealthy investors cover their ears in pain. Suddenly, the screens went pitch black. The whole room was plunged into shadows, and Grant was left standing on that stage in total darkness. His microphone was dead, and he was completely voiceless. I just looked at my brother, knowing I had the power to destroy his fake life. He wasn't the one in charge anymore. I had taken over the room, and I was about to show everyone the truth. Hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next part of this takedown. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. A second later, those black screens flashed back on with a blinding white light. All of Grant's branding was gone, wiped away like it never existed. In its place was something that made the whole room go silent. The main screen showed a high-resolution scan of a 30-year-old missing child poster. The words "Missing Heiress Elena Bancroft" were plastered across the wall in huge, bold letters. Right under that was a photo of a quiet 4-year-old girl, and right next to it was a giant, high-def photo of my own face. You couldn't deny the resemblance. The screen zoomed in on my eyes, showing the rare sapphire rings circling my pale green pupils, the exact same heterochromia from the childhood photo. You could hear a collective gasp from the crowd as the pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place. Before Grant could even find his footing, the massive screens around the room exploded with evidence that would change everything. The perimeter display split into multiple windows, flashing the official, encrypted lab documents we had grabbed just a few hours earlier. The lab's DNA report blasted across the hall, showing a 99.9% match with Richard and Elizabeth Bancroft. The green text on the screen vibrated with a finality that nobody could argue with. I watched the elite Wall Street investors lean forward, their skepticism melting into total shock. High-profile tech journalists started snapping photos, their cameras clicking as they realized the biggest startup of the year was dissolving right in front of them. If you're enjoying this takedown, smash that like button and let me know your thoughts in the comments. But here is the crazy part. The evidence was just getting started. Then came the moment that destroyed them financially. The screens began scrolling through thousands of pages of offshore banking records, wire transfers, and fake investor lists I had pulled from Grant's private servers. Every single transaction was out in the open for the public to witness. This digital trail formed an ironclad web, tracing millions of dollars flowing directly from the Bancroft family trust, through Andrew's fake corporations in tax havens, and straight into Grant's company treasury. The screen showed the routing numbers, forged signatures, and the fake venture capital registries Grant had used to trick Wall Street. It was the absolute proof that his entire billion-dollar empire was built on stolen money taken from a kidnapped child. Now this is where things get really intense. Total panic broke out on the main stage. Andrew, who had just been marched into the back of the room by federal agents, completely lost his cool. His expensive suit was rumpled, his hair was a mess, and his face was a mask of pure terror. He and Margaret started screaming, their voices cracking as they tried to gaslight everyone in the room. They pointed their shaking fingers directly at me, trying one final pathetic defense. Before we hear their lies, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you don't miss what happens next. Wait until you hear their excuse. "She is insane," Margaret shrieked, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch. "Do not look at those screens. This is a total lie. Our daughter is a dangerous, mentally unstable dropout who is having a breakdown. She's been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. She stole those files and twisted them because she is jealous of her brother's success. Security, turn those monitors off now. She is dangerous." Andrew struggled against the handcuffs, shouting over the crowd. "This is corporate spying," he roared, his voice cracking. "This girl is a criminal. She is unstable and needs to be locked away. These images are fake. My son is a genius. This is an illegal trap designed to tank our company." They stood on that stage, throwing their twisted lies against a wall of solid evidence, hoping their performance would hide the truth. But their words carried no weight. Their gaslighting was too loud and too desperate, and everyone saw right through it. But if they thought things couldn't get any worse, they were dead wrong. You won't believe how fast a $1 million life can turn into a total nightmare when the truth finally comes out. I stood there in my sharp charcoal suit, completely still with my hands folded, watching them fall apart with a cold sense of victory. The difference between my calm, predator-like energy and their wild, frantic screaming told the whole story to everyone watching. The rich investors and high society guests couldn't take their eyes off the scrolling screens. The financial data was just too perfect, and the routing numbers were too specific to be ignored or dismissed as the ramblings of a patient. A massive wave of shock hit the room, followed immediately by a loud, messy buzz of voices. Wall Street big shots were pulling out their phones, desperately calling their brokers to stop their pre-IPO buy orders before the markets even opened. If you're enjoying this takedown so far, smash that like button and let me know what you think. Technology reporters were whispering loudly, typing out breaking news alerts on their tablets as fast as they could. The fake image of a perfect family had completely shattered into a federal crime scene. The entire room was watching a public execution in real time. Grant stepped back from the podium, his face turning a pale, ashen gray as he realized he was finished. He stared at the scrolling transfers showing his private bank accounts, then looked down at his own hands, finally understanding that his stolen empire was disappearing into thin air. But here's the crazy part. He actually thought he could still talk his way out of it. He turned to Maya, opening his mouth to give her one last smooth, calculated sales pitch to save their marriage. But Maya was already done. She stepped away from him, her body stiff with a deep, burning disgust that filled the space between them. Every single lie had been peeled away, leaving her husband looking like a pathetic, fake loser. She walked across the stage, turning her back on his begging without even a second thought. Hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next part of this story. The high-profile guests watched the whole thing happen, their eyes pinning Grant down under a mountain of public embarrassment. The truth was out, and it was permanent for everyone involved in this greedy, toxic game. I stood tall, ready to watch every last piece of their stolen life burn to the ground. Maya stood frozen in the middle of the stage, the bright light from the digital screens hitting the sharp lines of her face. For a second, she just stared at the piles of financial documents being broadcast for everyone in the room to see. Her smart mind was moving fast, connecting all the dots, the fake investments, the hidden offshore accounts, and the horrible reality that the man she just married was nothing but a fraud. Now this is where it gets interesting. She didn't panic or start crying. Instead, a scary kind of absolute calm took over her. She slowly looked away from the evidence and searched the chaotic ballroom. She ignored the frantic investors and the loud reporters, looking straight at her father standing right next to me. David looked back at his daughter. He didn't say a word. He just gave her one slow, solid nod. That one move confirmed everything. Her father, a man known for his honesty, had just validated the nightmare. The foundation of her whole marriage was built on a 30-year kidnapping and a stolen inheritance. Which part of this betrayal surprised you the most? Drop it in the comments below. Grant was absolutely desperate. To try and save the last piece of his falling life, he lunged forward and grabbed Maya's hands. He forced a weak, shaking smile onto his face, trying to use that same fake charm he'd used to trick her from the very start. "Maya, please, you have to listen to me," Grant begged. His voice was cracking loudly, echoing over the noise of the ballroom. "This is all just a huge mistake. That girl is sick. She's a dangerous hacker who faked these files just to ruin us. You know me. We're building a future together. Don't let her crazy lies destroy what we have. If you're enjoying this drama so far, smash that like button and let me know what you think of Grant in the comments." Maya didn't say a word at first. She just looked down at his hands on hers, and the disgust in her eyes was so strong you could almost feel the weight of it. She smoothly and firmly ripped her hands away from his grip, stepping back like his very touch was poisonous. The pure hatred coming off her made Grant shrink away. The ballroom, which had been full of loud whispers, suddenly went completely silent. The rich crowd, the reporters, and the investors all held their breath. They were watching the total, unscripted destruction of a high society marriage right there on the main stage. But here is the crazy part. Maya was just getting started. "You don't get to speak to me," Maya said. Her voice wasn't a scream. It was dangerously low, calm, and perfectly clear in the huge hall, cutting through the air like a razor blade. "Every single word you ever told me about your genius, your hard work, and your amazing company was a total lie. You aren't a leader. You're just a thief playing dress-up in an expensive suit that was paid for by a stolen child." Grant started to stammer, his face turning a deep, embarrassing shade of red. "Maya, I built this company. I'm the CEO. I can explain where the money came from. I swear to you, I didn't know the money was stolen from her." Before we see her reaction, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next update. Now, this is where it gets even more interesting. Maya wasn't about to let him off the hook that easily. "Don't insult my intelligence," Maya snapped, her voice turning ice cold. "You knew exactly who was scrubbing your floors while you walked around pretending to be a self-made success. You happily watched your parents abuse a girl they held captive, and you were more than ready to spend the millions they stole to buy your fake reputation. You aren't just a liar, Grant. You're a parasite. You spent your whole pathetic life feeding off the talent and the blood of a woman you kept locked in a basement." Margaret was still struggling against the federal agents at the back of the room, and she shrieked out in protest. "Don't you talk to my son that way. We are a famous family. We are the elite." Maya didn't even give Margaret a look. She kept her eyes locked right on Grant, who was now shaking as the entire world watched him. "My family built our name on real brains, hard work, and total honesty," Maya said, her voice echoing with power. "We don't team up with criminals. We don't marry cowards who steal from kidnapping victims. And we definitely don't sit at the table with people who can't even write their own computer code." Grant opened his mouth to try and defend himself again, but Maya raised one hand, shutting him down instantly. She reached for her left hand and grabbed the massive, perfect diamond engagement ring and the wedding band Grant had given her just days ago. The stones caught the bright light of the chandeliers, sparkling against her skin. Which part of Maya's speech was your favorite? Drop it in the comments and share this with a friend who loves a good takedown. But wait until you see what she does with those rings next. In one smooth, quick motion, Maya slid those rings right off her finger, and you won't believe the look of pure terror on Grant's face. He had left his half-full glass of expensive vintage champagne sitting right there on the wooden podium when the screens first went dark. Maya reached out and picked up the crystal flute. She held her bare left hand over the rim, and without a second thought, dropped those multi-million-dollar diamonds straight into the bubbling alcohol. They sank all the way to the bottom with a heavy, dismissive clink that everyone in the room could hear. "Keep your stolen jewelry," Maya said, her voice sounding cold and absolutely final. "Use it to pay for your criminal defense lawyers. You're definitely going to need every single cent you can get." Without even a single look back, Maya turned away from her ruined husband. If you're enjoying this boss move by Maya, smash that like button right now. She walked down the short steps of the main stage, her long red evening gown trailing elegantly across the marble floor. The huge crowd of wealthy investors and shocked reporters instinctively moved aside for her, making a wide, clear path right through the middle of the grand ballroom. She walked with the undeniable grace of a woman who had just cut a massive, toxic weight out of her life. She crossed the big floor and walked straight toward our group. She stopped right next to her father, standing shoulder to shoulder with David and me. She looked at me, and her face softened with a look of deep respect and total unity. The three of us stood together like a solid, unbreakable wall, completely united against the fake family that had tried to destroy us. But here's the crazy part. The real chaos was only just starting. The view was absolutely perfect. The brilliant sister-in-law, the veteran federal agent, and the true Bancroft heiress, all standing victorious over the ruins of Grant's empire. The whole room stayed perfectly still, just trying to process the massive execution they had all just seen. Grant stood all by himself on that high stage, a broken man, staring blankly at the diamonds at the bottom of his glass, knowing his entire life had just been erased in front of everyone. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. So make sure to hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next part. The quiet in the ballroom was suddenly broken by the loud, authoritative voice of the lead federal agent. The tactical team moved with perfect timing, swarming the back of the room where Andrew and Margaret were still trying to argue. They were desperately trying to talk their way out of the truth, but it wasn't working at all. Two agents in heavy gear grabbed Andrew by the arms and forced him to spin around. The loud metallic click of the heavy iron handcuffs snapping shut echoed through the room over the whispers of the crowd. Andrew had spent 30 years pretending to be a perfect suburban man, but now his dignity was totally gone. He tried to struggle against the agents, yelling nonsense about calling his lawyers, but his complaining was useless. Margaret was doing even worse. As an agent reached out for her, she let out a loud, crazy scream and started swatting at his gear. "Don't you touch me," she yelled, her voice cracking under the pressure. "I am a respected member of this town. I demand that you let my husband go right now." The lead agent didn't even blink. He quickly pulled her arms behind her back and locked the heavy cuffs right over her expensive diamond bracelet. Which of these two deserved it more? Drop it in the comments. The reporters and photographers in the room didn't waste a second, and they all jumped into action, cameras flashing everywhere. The room exploded with hundreds of camera flashes all at once. It looked like a blinding strobe light show, but for Margaret and Andrew, it was the sound of their fake dynasty finally ending. These photographers were documenting every single second of their humiliating downfall for tomorrow's front pages. Margaret tried to hide her face against her shoulder, crying her eyes out as the bright lights caught her at her lowest point. Andrew didn't even try to hide. He just stared at the floor, knowing his entire life had been reduced to a public criminal spectacle. But here is the crazy part. Things were about to get even worse for Grant on the main stage. The rich investors and Wall Street big shots in the room had seen enough. Their phones were blowing up with calls as their teams back at the office scrambled to get away from this mess before they got burned. You could see the panic on their faces as they started tapping furiously on their screens. They were executing emergency plans to pull their money out and legally cancel every single deal they had made with Grant. If you're enjoying this justice as much as I am, go ahead and smash that like button right now. I kept my eyes on the giant digital screens above us. My customized program was still running, pulling live data straight from Grant's own corporate servers. The numbers representing how much his company was worth started to tank in real time. Billions of projected dollars just started bleeding away. It dropped to millions, then thousands, and then it just flatlined. The graphs on the screen dropped straight to zero. In less than 3 minutes, the company everyone thought was a billion-dollar unicorn was worth absolutely nothing. His whole empire, the one he built using my stolen inheritance and my silent work, turned into worthless digital dust. Now this is where it gets interesting, because Grant just stood there at the podium, completely frozen. To see what he does next, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next part. He watched the screens confirm his total destruction. It hit him with the force of a physical punch to the gut. He finally realized he had absolutely nothing left. His brilliant wife had already walked out and abandoned him. His criminal parents were being dragged out of the ballroom in handcuffs. His company was dead, and his reputation was burned to the ground. That arrogant golden boy look he always wore just melted away, leaving a desperate, hollow shell of a man who finally realized he was powerless. He stumbled down the steps of the stage, his expensive tuxedo looking pathetic on his defeated body. The crowd of angry investors moved out of his way like he had a contagious disease. Grant walked slowly across the marble floor, heading straight for the spot where David, Maya, and I were standing. His eyes were wide with blind panic. He was looking at my face, searching for any sign of the quiet, obedient maid he had bullied for 27 years. But when he finally reached me, his legs just gave out. The untouchable tech titan collapsed heavily onto his knees. The sharp thud of his kneecaps hitting the polished stone floor echoed through the quiet room. He looked up at me, his face covered in sweat and tears of pure desperation. He reached out with shaking hands, trying to grab the edge of my jacket. David took a small step forward, a silent, lethal warning that made Grant pull back his hands instantly. "Elena, please," Grant sobbed, his voice totally stripped of all its old arrogance. "Please, you can't do this to me. I had no idea they stole the money from you. I swear I didn't know anything about the kidnapping. You have to believe me. We grew up together. We shared a home. I am your brother. Which part of this downfall surprised you the most? Drop it in the comments. Wait until you see how this coward begs for his life. You have the power to stop this, Elena. Just tell them to let me keep the company. I'll give you any amount of ownership you want. Please, just show me some mercy. If you're enjoying seeing justice served, smash that like button right now." I stared down at the pathetic, crying man kneeling at my feet. For 27 long years, he had watched me clean the dirt off his shoes without saying a word. He gladly ate the fancy meals I cooked, wore the clean clothes I folded, and used the complex computer code I secretly wrote to keep his fake business running. He even laughed when his mother called me a worthless dropout. He smirked when she threw $50 at me and kicked me out onto the freezing streets. He never once saw me as a real human being, and he definitely didn't see me as a sister. He only cared now because I finally had the power to destroy him. I didn't feel any anger or pity or even a sense of winning. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, surgical detachment. I looked down at him with the steady power of a woman who had finally taken back her stolen throne. "You are not my brother," I said. My voice was calm and clear, echoing through the silent ballroom. "You are just a parasite that lived off my stolen life. You watched them lock me in a basement, and you happily spent the millions they laundered in your name. You loved every second of my misery because it made you feel superior. But here is where it gets even colder." Grant let out a loud, broken cry and pressed his hands together like he was praying. "Please, Elena, I'm begging you." I tilted my head a little, watching him fall apart with total satisfaction. To see how the rest of this family falls, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. I stepped back, moving away from him for the last time. "A master doesn't beg a servant for mercy," I told him, delivering a cold and final rejection. And a real heir doesn't make deals with thieves. I turned my back on him completely and walked toward the exit. Right away, 2 federal agents stepped forward. They grabbed the crying, ruined golden child off the floor and locked his wrists in cold metal. The sound of those handcuffs clicking shut was the perfect ending to a 30-year nightmare. I walked out of the Grand Plaza Hotel as the flashing lights of the news trucks disappeared into the dark night behind us. David, Maya, and I got into the back of a black car. The heavy doors closed with a solid thud, silencing the screaming reporters outside. Now this is where it gets really interesting. The fallout from that night was a total collapse for the people who stole my life. Within just 48 hours, the federal justice system started moving fast, leaving the fake family completely stuck. Andrew and Margaret were taken straight to a high-security federal jail. They were stripped of their expensive clothes, their jewelry was taken as evidence, and they were forced into ugly orange jumpsuits. Their first court appearance was a huge shock for the rich people in high society. The judge looked at the data I had leaked and stared at the couple with total disgust. Because they had secret bank accounts and because the kidnapping was so cruel, the judge said no to bail. They weren't going anywhere. Which part of this downfall surprised you most? Drop it in the comments and share this with a friend. Imagine waking up in a luxury penthouse and ending the day in a cold concrete cell, because that's exactly how fast their lives fell apart. They were thrown straight into federal custody and locked in tiny isolation cells while the government built a massive case against them. We are talking about an ironclad list of charges: kidnapping across state lines, grand larceny, identity theft, and wire fraud worth millions of dollars. They were officially looking at spending the rest of their lives in a federal prison with zero chance of parole. If you're enjoying this takedown so far, smash that like button. The fallout hit Grant like a freight train, and it moved with terrifying speed. By the very next morning, the SEC launched a huge emergency investigation into his tech company. Federal agents and forensic auditors actually stormed his glass office building, seizing every hard drive, server, and financial record they could get their hands on. His big company launch was permanently cancelled before the opening bell even rang, and the whole business was forced into immediate liquidation. Within just a few days, all of Grant's personal money was frozen as investigators uncovered the full scale of his money laundering scheme. But here's the crazy part. I got to watch from a distance as every single piece of his stolen success was stripped away by the court. Foreclosure notices were aggressively taped to the glass front doors of his $10 million downtown penthouse. His entire fleet of expensive foreign sports cars was towed away right in the middle of the day, watched by all the high society neighbors he had worked so hard to impress. His exclusive country club kicked him out, and his fake executive status vanished in an instant. Since he was now completely broke and couldn't afford his private lawyers, the court assigned him a public defender, while the Department of Justice hit him with serious accessory charges. He was legally trapped, facing a decade in prison for running a business funded entirely by theft. Now this is where it gets really interesting. While they were rotting in their cells, I shifted my focus to finally reclaiming my stolen identity. The elite legal team David put together worked around the clock to finish the master plan. We sat in a high-rise office looking out over the city skyline, surrounded by piles of family records, original police reports from the fire, and perfect DNA profiles. The whole process was direct and incredibly empowering. I picked up a heavy fountain pen, my hand finally steady after years of being forced to obey. With one smooth motion, I signed the petition to officially take back my true name. Make sure you hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss what happens next. The fake identity Andrew and Margaret had branded me with for 27 years was wiped from every government record. The birth certificate they had faked to hide their crime was legally cancelled by a federal judge and replaced with a real document that restored my true name and lineage as Elena Bancroft. I watched the court clerk press the official state seal onto the paperwork, and that sound felt like it finally erased my abusers from my life forever. Legally, they were no longer connected to me at all. They were just common kidnappers in the eyes of the law. But wait until you hear this. The final payoff happened when the legal team started the verification process for the Bancroft Family Trust Fund. Imagine standing in front of a vault that's been locked for 30 years, knowing your entire life is about to change forever. The Swiss Wealth Management Bank in Geneva didn't waste any time once they were presented with federal court orders and the certified DNA match. Those massive, impenetrable doors that had been frozen for 3 long decades finally started to move as the time locks collapsed. I stood there, my heart racing, with David and Maya right by my side as the bank's terminal initialized a live, secured biometric scan. I pressed my thumb firmly against the cold, encrypted glass panel and stared directly into the optical scanner, letting the camera read the unique sapphire rings circling my green pupils. CTA. If you're enjoying seeing her finally take back her life, smash that like button for me. Rehook. But wait until you hear how much was actually inside that vault. The system let out a sharp, high-pitched beep, confirming my identity as the true heir. In an instant, $250 million were transferred into a pristine wealth account under my absolute, unrestricted control. This was the massive fortune my biological parents had established to protect my future, and it was finally in my hands. It's honestly chilling to think that Andrew and Margaret kept me locked in a dark basement for years, treating me like a disposable broken servant, while being completely blind to the fact that my blood was the only key to this vault. I closed the legal portfolio, feeling a quiet, powerful sense of absolute peace settle over my mind. The legal warfare was finally over, the execution had been flawless, and the real Elena Bancroft had officially returned to claim her kingdom. CTA. We're almost at the end of this chapter, so hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next big reveal. Rehook. Now this is where the story takes a turn you might not expect. 6 months after the gavel fell on my former captors, the kingdom I built looked entirely different than the sterile, greed-driven corporate offices Andrew and Grant had worshipped. I was sitting at the head of a massive live-edge walnut table in the sunlit boardroom of the newly established Bancroft Foundation. Huge floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, unobstructed view of the city skyline, which was a beautiful contrast to the windowless concrete basement where I had spent the first 27 years of my life. I wasn't hiding behind a mop or wearing a cheap hospital gown anymore. I wore a tailored navy blazer and reviewed a thick portfolio of grant applications with the sharp focus of a woman completely in control of her own destiny. My foundation wasn't some vanity project designed to buy favor with high society. It was a highly tactical, aggressively funded initiative aimed directly at providing elite cybersecurity education and advanced coding boot camps to vulnerable, at-risk youth. Rehook. But here is the reason why I chose this specific mission. I knew exactly what it meant to be trapped, isolated, and stripped of all physical power. I also knew that handing a brilliant cornered mind the digital keys to the modern world was the ultimate equalizer. We were building state-of-the-art computer labs in forgotten neighborhoods, teaching kids how to build impenetrable networks and write code that could break through any ceiling. We were actively forging the next generation of digital architects, ensuring they would never be held captive by anyone ever again. Sitting directly across from me at that boardroom table was Maya. She had completely shed the toxic weight of her brief, fraudulent marriage to Grant, emerging even sharper and more formidable than before. She now served as chief legal counsel for the Bancroft Foundation, bringing her fierce intellect and integrity to every single contract and initiative we launched. She looked stunning in a striking ivory suit, her dark eyes scanning a complex legal document with lethal precision. She flipped the page, signed her name with a swift stroke of her pen, and slid the finalized contract across the polished wood toward me. That secures the funding for 3 new tech centers in the coastal district, Maya announced, her voice radiating absolute confidence. CTA. Which part of her new foundation surprised you the most? Drop a comment and let me know. Wait until you hear how we handled the people who tried to stand in our way. The city board tried to trap us in a mountain of paperwork and rules, but I just reminded them exactly how much money we were bringing to the table. They gave up in less than 10 minutes. I smiled as I signed my name at the bottom of the document, officially moving the money for the new tech centers. If you're enjoying this journey so far, smash that like button right now. Maya, you are honestly terrifying when you're in a meeting, I said, handing the folder over to our assistant. She leaned back in her chair, and for the first time, a real warm smile lit up her face. I learned from the best, Elena, she said. We don't waste time with people who just want to suck us dry, and we definitely don't let some city workers stop our progress. The respect we had for each other was deep. We weren't just connected by some fake marriage or a piece of paper anymore. We were connected because we survived together. We won together. We had a real sisterhood that people like Andrew and Margaret would never be able to understand. But here is where it gets really interesting. As the sun started to go down, painting the city in a beautiful golden light, we finished up the last meeting of the month. Maya and I took our private elevator down to the garage where a heavy armored car was waiting for us. We weren't going back to some tiny apartment or a cheap motel on the side of the road. No, we were headed straight for the coast. We were going to the exact spot where the old Bancroft family mansion burned to the ground 30 years ago. I had used a part of my inheritance to clear away all the old ashes and build something new, a massive modern home right on the edge of the cliffs. The drive was so quiet and peaceful. All we could hear was the soft sound of the engine. It felt good to finally be with someone where we didn't have to talk to feel comfortable. Neither of us had to look over our shoulders anymore. If you want to see how this all ends, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next part of the story. But wait until you see the house we built on those ruins. When the heavy iron gates finally opened, the car drove up a long, winding path lined with old oak trees and gardens that smelled like flowers and the ocean air. The house itself was incredible. It was made of huge sheets of glass and natural stone, and it looked like it belonged there, right next to the sea. I got out of the car and walked into the main hallway, feeling the solid energy of a home that actually belonged to me. I walked straight through to the back and pushed open the heavy glass doors that led out to a huge stone balcony. The view was amazing. I could see the Atlantic Ocean crashing against the rocks below. The wind was cold and salty, blowing through my hair, and the sound of the waves made me feel more alive than I had in years. Now, this is where it gets even better. A second later, I heard those familiar, heavy footsteps behind me. It was David. He walked up and stood right next to me, leaning his hands on the glass railing. He had officially quit his old job and was now the head of security for all the Bancroft properties. But to me, he was much more than just an employee. He was the investigator who looked past my messy clothes and the lies everyone told about me. He saw the truth in my eyes when no one else would. He was the protective father figure I never had growing up. Maya joined us on the balcony a moment later, handing me a hot cup of coffee. The three of us just stood there, side by side, looking out at the water where the dark ocean met the night sky. There were no cameras watching us, no fancy people we had to impress, and finally, there were no more lies left to tell. I honestly never thought we'd make it here. But what do you think was the most important step in our journey? Let's talk about it in the comments. The silence we shared wasn't born from fear or being forced to listen. It was that thick, heavy silence you only get when you're finally free. I sat there, taking a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through me as I thought about how crazy my life had become. If you're glad she finally made it, hit that like button right now. For 27 long years, I was brainwashed to believe that my bloodline decided what I was worth. I thought being completely alone was just a punishment I couldn't escape. I was taught that family was a place built on secrets, cold hearts, and doing exactly what you were told. But standing here with a genius lawyer who fought for me and a retired agent who risked everything to show the world the truth, I finally got it. The family you're born into might start your story, but the family you choose is the one that gets to rewrite the ending. Being a billionaire came from my blood, but being a whole person, that came from loyalty, courage, and real respect. The scared girl who used to scrub floors in the dark and hide when she heard footsteps, she's gone forever. I closed my eyes and listened to the waves hitting the shore, finally at peace with the massive empire I now controlled. I wasn't that broken maid in the basement anymore. I was Elena Bancroft, the boss of my own incredible world. But here's the crazy part about power. It's something that can't be held down forever, as long as you keep building your own strength inside. For decades, They tried to break me with mental abuse and physical isolation in a fake world they built just for me. They stole my money, my name, and my dignity. They actually thought that by controlling my room, they could control my mind. But they were so wrong. Instead of giving up in that dark basement, I turned my isolation into a weapon. I took the very tools they gave me for work and used them to become a master of cybersecurity and network systems. It just goes to show a huge truth about hard times. When people try to bury you, they are actually giving you the darkness you need to grow. The biggest mistake a bully can make is underestimating the person they're picking on. If you're finding this story as powerful as I am, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into these incredible journeys. Now this is where it really hits home. Our true value isn't what other people call us. It doesn't matter if they say we're broken, crazy, or worthless. Who we really are is built in those quiet moments when we refuse to give up and keep our freedom to think for ourselves. I didn't wait for some hero to come save me or hand me a weapon. I built my own digital army right under their noses while they weren't even looking. My win at the end wasn't just some lucky break. It was the result of years spent turning a prison cell into a training ground. We all deal with tough spots or people who try to make us feel small and limit what we can do. But it's our job to say no to those lies. We have to secretly build the skills that will eventually set us free. You have to take the walls that are blocking you right now and turn them into the foundation of your own independence. So, which part of Elena's transformation surprised you the most? Drop a comment below and share this with someone who needs to hear that their current struggle is just their training ground. You aren't what they say you are. You are exactly who you choose to become.